Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. Among other public buildings in a certain town, which for many reasons it will be prudent to refrain from mentioning, and to which I will assign no fictitious name, there is one anciently common to most towns, great or small, to wit, a workhouse. And in this workhouse was born the item of mortality called Oliver Twist. After a few struggles, Oliver gave the first proof of the free and proper action of his lungs. A faint voice imperfectly articulated the words, "Let me see the child and die." The surgeon said with more kindness than might have been expected of him, "Oh, you must not talk about dying yet." "Law bless her dear heart, no," interrupted the old nurse. "When she has lived as long as I have, sir, and had 13 children of her own, and all of 'em dead except 2, and them in the workhouse with me, she'll know better than to take on in that way. Bless her dear heart. Think what it is to be a mother. There's a dear young lamb, do." Apparently this consolatory perspective of a mother's prospects failed in producing its due effect. The patient shook her head and stretched out her hand towards the child. The surgeon deposited it in her arms. She imprinted her cold white lips passionately on its forehead, passed her hands over her face, gazed wildly round, shuddered, fell back, and died. The surgeon leaned over the body and raised the left hand. The old story," he said. "No wedding ring, I see." Oliver cried lustily. If he could have known that he was an orphan left to the tender mercies of churchwardens and overseers, perhaps he would have cried the louder. Oliver Twist's 9th birthday found him keeping it in one of the branch workhouses some 3 miles off, in the coal cellar, with a select party of 2 other young gentlemen who, after participating with him in a sound thrashing, had been locked up therein for atrociously presuming to be hungry, when Mrs. Mann, the good lady of the house, was unexpectedly startled by the apparition of Mr. Bumble, the beadle. Mrs. Mann ushered the beadle into a small parlour, placed a seat for him, and officiously deposited his cocked hat and cane on the table before him. "Now, will you take a little drop of something, Mr. Bumble?" said Mrs. Mann persuasively. "Just a little drop?" The beadle stirred the gin and water.
"I drink your health with cheerfulness, Mrs. Mann."
And he swallowed half of it.
"And now, about business," said the beadle. "The child, Oliver Twist, is 9 years old today."
"Bless him," interposed Mrs. Mann.
Oliver being now too old to remain here, the board have determined to have him back into the workhouse. I've come out myself to take him there, so let me see him at once."
Oliver was led into the room by his benevolent protectress.
"Will you go along with me, Oliver?" said Mr. Bumble in a majestic voice.
"Will she go with me?" inquired poor Oliver.
"No, she can't," replied Mr. Bumble. "But she'll come and see you sometimes."
This was no very great consolation to the child. Young as he was, however, he had sense enough to make a feint of feeling great regret at going away. Hunger and ill usage are great assistants if you want to cry, and the little companions of misery he was leaving behind were the only friends he had ever known. The room in the workhouse in which the boys were fed was a large stone hall with a copper at one end, out of which the master, dressed in an apron for the purpose, ladled the gruel at meal-times. Of this festive composition, each boy had 1 bowl, and no more. Boys generally have excellent appetites. Oliver Twist and his companions got so voracious and wild with hunger that one boy was afraid he might some night happen to eat the boy who slept next to him. A council was held. Lots were cast who should walk up to the master after supper that evening and ask for more, and it fell to Oliver Twist. The evening arrived. The gruel was served out. The gruel disappeared. Oliver rose from the table, and advancing to the master, basin and spoon in hand, said, "Please, sir, I want some more." The master was a fat, healthy man, but he turned very pale. He gazed in stupefied astonishment on the small rebel for some seconds, and then clung for support to the copper. "What?" said the master in a faint voice. "Please, sir," replied Oliver, "I want some more." The master aimed a blow at Oliver's head with the ladle and shrieked aloud for the beadle. Mr. Bumble rushed into the room in great excitement. Oliver was ordered into instant confinement, and next morning it was arranged that Oliver should go to Mr. Sowerberry, the parochial undertaker, upon liking, a phrase which means that if the master find, upon a short trial, that he can get enough work out of a boy without putting too much food into him, he shall have him for a term of years to do what he likes with. When little Oliver was informed that he was to go as general house lad to a coffin-maker's, he evinced so little emotion that by common consent he was pronounced a hardened young rascal, and Mr. Bumble was ordered to remove him forthwith. The undertaker, who had just put up the shutters of his shop, was making entries of his day-book by the light of a dismal candle when Mr. Bumble entered.
"I've brought the boy, Mr. Sowerberry."
Oliver made a bow. The undertaker raised the candle above his head to get a better view of Oliver. Mrs. Sowerberry emerged from a little room behind the shop.
"My dear," said Mr. Sowerberry, "this is the boy from the workhouse that I told you of."
Oliver bowed again.
"Dear me," said the undertaker's wife, "he's very small."
"Why, he is rather small," replied Mr. Bumble, looking at Oliver. "There's no denying it. But he'll grow, Mrs. Sowerberry. He'll grow."
"Ah, I dare say he will," replied the lady pettishly, "on our victuals and our drink. There, get downstairs, little bag of bones."
With this, the undertaker's wife opened a side door and pushed Oliver down a steep flight of stairs into a stone cell, damp and dark, forming the anteroom to the coal cellar, and denominated the kitchen, where she ordered a slatternly girl to give him some cold bits that were put by for the dog. Oliver clutched at the dainty meats that the dog had neglected, and tore the bits asunder with all the ferocity of famine. Oliver was awakened in the morning by a loud kicking at the outside of the shop door, which, before he could huddle on his clothes, was repeated in an angry and impetuous manner about 25 times.
"Open the door, will you?"
"I will directly, sir," replied Oliver, undoing the chain and turning the key. A big charity boy was sitting on a post in front of the house, eating a slice of bread and butter. "I beg your pardon, sir," said Oliver at length, seeing that no other visitor made his appearance. "Did you knock?"
"You don't know who I am, I suppose, workhouse?" said the boy.
"No, sir," rejoined Oliver.
"I'm Mr. Noah Claypole, and you're under me. Take down the shutters, you idle young ruffian."
Noah was a charity boy, but not a workhouse orphan. No chance child was he, for he could trace his genealogy all the way back to his parents, who lived hard by, his mother being a washerwoman and his father a drunken soldier. The month's trial over, Oliver was formally apprenticed. It was a nice, sickly season just at this time. In commercial phrase, coffins were looking up, and Oliver had acquired a great deal of experience. Noah Claypole used him far worse than before, now that his jealousy was aroused by seeing the new boy promoted to the black stick and hat band. One day Oliver and Noah had descended into the kitchen to banquet upon 1.5 pounds of the worst end of the neck, when Noah, being hungry and vicious, got rather personal.
"Workhouse," said Noah, "how's your mother?"
"She's dead," replied Oliver. "Don't say anything more to me about her. You better not."
"You know, workhouse, your mother was a regular right-down bad un."
"What did you say?" inquired Oliver, looking up very quickly.
"A regular right-down bad un, workhouse," replied Noah coolly.
Crimson with fury, Oliver started up, overthrew the chair and table, seized Noah by the throat, shook him in the violence of his rage till his teeth chattered in his head, and collecting his whole force into one heavy blow, felled him to the ground.
Oh, he'll murder me," blubbered Noah. "Help, help!"
Mrs. Sowerberry plunged into the kitchen and held Oliver with one hand while she scratched his face with the other. In this favourable position of affairs, Noah rose from the ground and pommelled him behind. This was rather too violent exercise to last long. When they were all wearied out and could tear and beat no longer, they dragged Oliver, struggling and shouting, but nothing daunted, into the dust cellar, and there locked him up. This being done, Mrs. Sowerberry sunk into a chair and burst into tears. "Oh, said Mrs. Sowerberry, speaking as well as she could through a deficiency of breath. "Oh, what a mercy we've not all been murdered in our beds. Noah, you poor fellow." And she looked piteously on the charity boy. Noah, whose top waistcoat button might have been somewhere on a level with the crown of Oliver's head, rubbed his eyes with the inside of his wrists while this commiseration was bestowed upon him, and performed some affecting tears and sniffs. "What's to be done?" exclaimed Mrs. Sowerberry. "Your master's not at home. Run to Mr. Bumble, Noah, and tell him to come here directly and not to lose a minute. Never mind your cap. Make haste. You can hold a knife to that black eye as you run along, and it'll keep the swelling down." Noah stopped to make no reply, but started off at his fullest speed, and very much it astonished the people who were out walking to see a charity boy tearing through the streets pell-mell with no cap on his head and a clasp knife at his eye. Noah Claypole paused not once for breath until he reached the workhouse gate. Having rested here for a minute or so to collect a good burst of sobs and an imposing show of tears and terror, he knocked loudly at the wicket. "Oh, Mr. Bumble, sir," said Noah. "Oliver, sir. Oliver has—"
"What? What?"
interposed Mr. Bumble, with a gleam of pleasure in his metallic eyes.
"Not run away? He hasn't run away, has he, Noah?"
"Oh, no, sir. No, not run away, sir, but he's turned vicious," replied Noah. "He tried to murder me, sir, and then he tried to murder Charlotte, and then Mrs. Oh, what dreadful pain it is! Oh, such agony, please, sir." When Noah saw that the intelligence he communicated perfectly paralysed Mr. Bumble, he imparted additional effect thereunto by bewailing his dreadful wounds 10 times louder than before. Mr. Bumble and Noah Claypole betook themselves with all speed to the undertaker's shop. Here the position of affairs had not at all improved, as Sowerberry had not yet returned, and Oliver continued to kick with undiminished vigour at the cellar door. The accounts of his ferocity, as related by Mrs. Sowerberry, were of so startling a nature that Mr. Bumble judged it prudent to parley before opening the door. With this view, he gave a kick at the outside by way of prelude, and then, applying his mouth to the keyhole, said in a deep and impressive tone,
"Oliver."
"Come, you let me out," replied Oliver from the inside.
"Do you know this here voice, Oliver?"
said Mr. Bumble. "Yes," replied Oliver.
"Ain't you afraid of it, sir? Ain't you a-trembling while I speak, sir?"
said Mr. Bumble. "No," replied Oliver boldly. An answer so different from the one he had expected to elicit and was in the habit of receiving staggered Mr. Bumble not a little. He stepped back from the keyhole, drew himself up to his full height, and looked from one to another there of the bystanders in mute astonishment. "Oh, you know, Mr. Bumble, he must be mad," said Mrs. Sowerberry. "No boy in half his senses could venture to speak so to you."
"It's not madness, mum,"
replied Mr. Bumble after a few moments of deep meditation.
"It's meat."
"What?" exclaimed Mrs. Sowerberry.
"Meat, mum. Meat,"
replied Mr. Bumble with stern emphasis.
"You've overfed him, mum. You've raised a artificial soul and spirit in him, mum, unbecoming a person of his condition. What have paupers to do with soul or spirit? It's quite enough that we let 'em have live bodies. If you had kept the boy on gruel, mum, this would never have happened."
"Dear, dear," ejaculated Mrs. Sowerberry, piously raising her eyes to the kitchen ceiling. "This comes of being liberal." Sowerberry returned at this juncture. Oliver's offence having been explained to him, he at once gave him a drubbing and ordered him upstairs to his dismal bed. With the first ray of light that struggled through the crevices in the shutters, Oliver rose and unbarred the door. One timid look around, one moment's pause of hesitation. He had closed it behind him and was in the open street. He looked to the right and to the left, uncertain whither to fly. Arriving at a footpath across the fields, which he knew after some distance led out again into the road, he struck into it and walked quickly on. Early on the 7th morning after he had left his native place, Oliver limped slowly into the little town of Barnet. The street was empty. Not a soul had awakened to the business of the day. The sun was rising in all his splendid beauty, but the light only served to show the boy his own lonesomeness and desolation, as he sat with bleeding feet and covered with dust upon a cold doorstep. He had been crouching on the step for some time, when a boy, who had passed him carelessly some minutes before, returned and was surveying him most earnestly from the opposite side of the way. The boy was about his own age, but one of the queerest-looking boys that Oliver had ever seen. He was a snub-nosed, flat-browed, common-faced boy, and as dirty a juvenile as one could wish to see, but he had about him all the airs and manners of a man.
"Hello, my covey. What's the row?"
said this strange young gentleman to Oliver.
"I am very hungry and tired,"
replied Oliver, the tears standing in his eyes as he spoke.
"I have been walking these 7 days." "Going to London?"
"Yes."
"Got any lodgings?"
"No."
"Money?"
"No." The strange boy whistled and put his arms into his pockets.
"I suppose you want some place to sleep in tonight, don't you?"
"I do indeed," answered Oliver. "I have not slept under a roof since I left the country."
"Oh, don't fret your eyelids on that score," said the young gentleman. "I've got to be in London tonight, and I know a respectable old gentleman as lives there what will give you lodgings for nothing, and never ask for the change. Certainly not."
This unexpected offer of shelter was too tempting to be resisted. This led to a more friendly and confidential dialogue, from which Oliver discovered that his friend's name was Jack Dawkins, though among his intimate friends he was better known as the Artful Dodger. As Jack Dawkins objected to their entering London before nightfall, it was nearly 11 o'clock when they reached the turnpike at Islington. Then the Dodger scudded at a rapid pace, directing Oliver to follow at his heels until he pushed open the door of a house near Field Lane. The walls and ceiling of the room were perfectly black with age and dirt. There was a deal table before the fire, upon which were a candle stuck in a ginger beer bottle, 2 or 3 pewter pots, a loaf and butter, and a plate. In a frying pan which was on the fire, some sausages were cooking, and standing over them, with a toasting fork in his hand, was a very old shrivelled Jew, whose villainous-looking and repulsive face was obscured by a quantity of matted red hair. He seemed to be dividing his attention between the frying pan and a clothes-horse, over which a great number of silk handkerchiefs were hanging. 4 or 5 boys, none older than the Dodger, all crowded about their associate as he whispered a few words to the Jew.
"This is him, Fagin," said Jack Dawkins. "My friend, Oliver Twist."
Fagin grinned.
"We are very glad to see you, Oliver. Very. Dodger, take off the sausages and draw a tub near the fire for Oliver. Ah, you're staring at the pocket handkerchiefs, eh, my dear? We've just looked them out, ready for the wash. That's all, Oliver. That's all."
This was hailed by a boisterous shout from all the hopeful pupils of the merry old gentleman, in the midst of which they went to supper. It was late next morning when Oliver awoke from a sound, long sleep. There was no other person in the room but the old Jew, who was boiling some coffee in a saucepan for breakfast, and whistling softly to himself. He turned round and looked at Oliver, and called him by his name. He did not answer, and was to all appearance asleep. After satisfying himself upon this head, the Jew then drew forth, as it seemed to Oliver, from some trap in the floor, a small box, which he placed carefully on the table. His eyes glistened as he raised the lid and looked in. From the box he took a magnificent gold watch, sparkling with jewels. At least 6 more were severally drawn forth from the same box, and surveyed with equal pleasure, besides rings, brooches, bracelets, and other articles of jewellery. Having replaced these trinkets, his bright, dark eyes fell on Oliver's face. The boy's eyes were now fixed on his in mute curiosity. The Jew closed the lid of the box with a loud crash, and laying his hand on a bread knife which was on the table, started furiously up. He trembled very much, though, for even in his terror Oliver could see that the knife quivered in the air.
"What's that?" said Fagin. "What do you watch me for? Why are you awake? What have you seen? Speak out, boy. Quick, quick for your life."
"I wasn't able to sleep any longer, sir," replied Oliver, meekly. "I'm very sorry if I have disturbed you, sir."
"You were not awake an hour ago?"
said the Jew, scowling fiercely.
No, indeed," replied Oliver.
"Are you sure?"
"Upon my word I was not, sir."
"Tush, tush, my dear,"
said Fagin, abruptly resuming his old manner and playing with the knife a little before he laid it down.
"Of course I know that, my dear. I only tried to frighten you. You're a brave boy. You're a brave boy, Oliver."
The door opened and the Dodger returned, accompanied by a very sprightly young friend whom Oliver had seen on the previous night, and who was now formally introduced to him as Charlie Bates.
"Well,"
said the Jew, glancing slyly at Oliver,
"I hope you've been at work this morning, my dears."
"Hard," replied the Dodger.
"As nails,"
added Charlie Bates.
"Good boys, good boys. What have you got, Dodger?"
said Fagin.
"A couple of pocketbooks,"
replied the Dodger.
Not so heavy as they might be, but very neat and nicely made. Ingenious workman, ain't he, Oliver?"
"Oh, very, indeed, sir,"
said Oliver, at which Mr. Charles Bates laughed uproariously, very much to the amazement of Oliver, who saw nothing to laugh at in anything that had passed. When breakfast was cleared away, the merry old gentleman and the two boys played at a very curious and uncommon game, which was performed this way. The merry old gentleman, placing a snuff-box in one pocket of his trousers, a note-case in the other, and a watch in his waistcoat pocket, with a guard chain round his neck, and sticking a mock diamond pin in his shirt, buttoned his coat tight round him, and putting his spectacle case and handkerchief in his pockets, trotted up and down the room with a stick, in imitation of the manner in which old gentlemen walk about the streets any hour in the day. All this time the two boys followed him closely about, getting out of his sight so nimbly every time he turned round that it was impossible to follow their motions. At last the Dodger trod upon his toes, while Charlie Bates stumbled up against him behind, and in that one moment they took from him, with the most extraordinary rapidity, snuff-box, note-case, watch, guard-chain, shirt-pin, pocket, handkerchief. When this game had been played a great many more times, a couple of young ladies called to see the young gentleman, one of whom was named Bet, and the other Nancy. Being remarkably free and agreeable in their manners, Oliver thought them very nice girls indeed. At length the Dodger and Charlie and the two young ladies went away together, having been kindly furnished by the amiable old Jew with money to spend.
"Now, my dear," said Fagin to Oliver, "is my handkerchief hanging out of my pocket, my dear?"
"Yes, sir,"
said Oliver.
"See if you can take it out without my feeling it, as you saw them do."
Oliver held out the bottom of the pocket with one hand, as he had seen the Dodger hold it, and drew the handkerchief lightly out of it with the other.
"Is it gone?"
cried Fagin.
"Here it is, sir,"
said Oliver, showing it in his hand.
"Oh, you're a clever boy, my dear,"
said the playful old gentleman, patting Oliver on the head approvingly.
"I never saw a sharper lad. Here's a shilling for you. If you go on in this way, you'll be the greatest man of the time."
One morning Fagin gave his assent for Oliver to go out under the joint guardianship of Charlie Bates and his friend the Dodger. The two boys sallied out at a lazy, ill-looking saunter, with Oliver between them, wondering where they were going. They were just emerging from a narrow court when the Dodger made a sudden stop. "What's the matter?" demanded Oliver.
"Hush," replied the Dodger. "Do you see that old cove at the bookstall?"
"The old gentleman over the way," said Oliver.
"Yes, I see him."
"He'll do,"
said the Dodger.
"A prime plant,"
observed Master Charlie Bates. The two boys walked stealthily across the road and slunk close behind the old gentleman. Oliver stood looking on in silent amazement as he saw the Dodger plunge his hand into the old gentleman's pocket and draw from thence a handkerchief. And what was Oliver's horror and alarm to see him hand the same to Charlie Bates, and finally to behold them both running away round the corner at full speed. In an instant, the whole mystery of the handkerchiefs and the watches and the jewels and the Jew rushed upon the boy's mind. Confused and frightened, Oliver took to his heels, and not knowing what he did, made off as fast as he could lay his feet to the ground. In the very instant when Oliver began to run, the old gentleman, putting his hand to his pocket, missing his handkerchief, turned sharp round. Seeing the boy scudding away, he very naturally concluded him to be the culprit, and shouting, "Stop, thief!" with all his might, made off after him, book in hand. "Stop, thief!" The cry is taken up by 100 voices. He is stopped at last. He is down upon the pavement, and the crowd eagerly gather round him. A police officer, who is generally the last person to arrive in such cases, at that moment made his way through the crowd and seized Oliver by the collar. "Don't hurt him," said the old gentleman compassionately.
Are you the party that's been robbed, sir?"
"Yes, I am," replied the old gentleman, "but I am not sure that this boy actually took the handkerchief. I would rather not press the case."
"Must go before the magistrate now, sir."
"Wait. There's something in that boy's face," said the old gentleman to himself, tapping his chin with the cover of the book in a thoughtful manner. "Bless my soul! Where have I seen something like that look before?"
"Stop! Stop! Don't take him away! For heaven's sake, stop a moment!" cried a newcomer. "I saw it all. I keep the bookstall. I saw 3 boys, 2 others, and the prisoner here loitering on the opposite side of the way when this gentleman was reading. The robbery was committed by another boy. I saw it done."
"The gentleman was reading, was he?"
inquired the officer.
"Yes," replied the man, "the very book he has in his hand."
"Oh, that book, eh? Is it paid for?" The bookseller replied with a smile, "No, it is not." "Oh, dear me, I forgot all about it," exclaimed the old gentleman innocently.
"A nice person to prefer a charge against a poor boy," said the police officer. "I consider, sir, that the boy is free to go."
Little Oliver Twist lay on his back on the pavement, his face a deadly white, and a cold tremble convulsing his whole frame. Poor boy, said the old gentleman, whose name was Brownlow. He bent over him. "Call a coach, somebody, pray, directly." A coach was obtained, and Oliver having been carefully laid on one seat, the old gentleman got in and sat himself on the other, and away they drove. Weak and thin and pallid, Oliver awoke and looked anxiously around. "What room is this? Where have I been brought to? This is not the place I went to sleep in." A motherly old lady, a Mrs. Bedwin by name, very neatly and precisely dressed, sat in an armchair close by. They were in the housekeeper's room, which belonged to her. "Hush, my dear," said the old lady softly. "You must be very quiet, or you will be ill again." Then the old gentleman came in, but he had no sooner raised his spectacles on his forehead and thrust his hands behind the skirts of his coat to take a good long look at Oliver than his countenance underwent a very great variety of odd contortions. "Why, what's this? Bedwin, look there!" As Mr. Brownlow spoke, he pointed hastily to the picture above Oliver's head, and then to the boy's face. There was its living copy. The eyes, the head, the mouth, every feature was the same. The expression was, for the instant, so precisely alike that the minutest line seemed copied with a startling accuracy. Oliver knew not the cause of this sudden exclamation, for not being strong enough to bear the start it gave him, he fainted away.
"Where's Oliver?"
said the furious Fagin, rising with a menacing look.
"Speak out, or I'll throttle you."
Charlie Bates dropped upon his knees.
"What's become of the boy?"
said Fagin, seizing the Dodger tightly by the collar.
"Why, the traps have got him, and that's all about it," said the Dodger sullenly. "Come, let go of me, will you?"
"Why, what the blazes is in the wind now?" growled a deep voice.
What's it all about, Fagin?
The man who growled out these words was a stoutly built fellow of about 35.
What are you up to? Ill-treating the boys, you covetous, avaricious, insatiable old fence? I wonder they don't murder you. I would if I was them.
Hush, hush, Mr. Sykes, said the Jew, trembling. Don't speak so loud.
None of your mistering, replied the ruffian. You always mean mischief when you come that.
Well then, Bill, you seem out of humour, Bill.
After swallowing 2 or 3 glassfuls of spirits, Mr. Sykes condescended to take some notice of the young gentleman, which gracious act led to a conversation in which the cause and manner of Oliver's capture were circumstantially detailed, with such alterations and improvements on the truth as to the dodger appeared most advisable under the circumstances.
I'm afraid, said the Jew, that he may say something which will get us into trouble.
That's very likely, returned Sykes with a malicious grin.
And, added Fagin, if the game is up with us, it might be up with a good many more.
The man started and turned fiercely round, but the old gentleman's shoulders were shrugged up to his ears. There was a long pause.
We must know where he is, my dears. He must be found, said Fagin. Charlie, do nothing but skulk about till you bring home some news of him. Nancy, my dear, I must have him found. I trust to you, my dear, to you and the artful, for everything.
One evening, as Oliver was sitting talking to Mrs. Bedwin, there came a message down from Mr. Brownlow that if Oliver Twist felt pretty well, he should like to see him in his study and to talk to him a little while. Now, said Mr. Brownlow, speaking, if possible, in a kinder, but at the same time in a much more serious manner, I want you to pay great attention, my boy, to what I am going to say. Oh, don't tell me you're going to send me away, sir, pray, exclaimed Oliver, alarmed at the serious tone of the old gentleman's commencement. Have mercy on a poor boy, sir. My dear child, you need not be afraid of my deserting you, unless you give me cause. I never will, sir. Well, let me hear your story, where you come from, who brought you up, and how you got into the company in which I found you. Speak the truth, and you shall not be friendless while I live. Oliver was on the point of beginning to relate how he had been carried to the workhouse by Mr. Bumble, when a servant running upstairs announced Mr. Grimwig. Is he coming up? Inquired Mr. Brownlow. Yes, sir, replied the servant. Mr. Brownlow smiled, and told Oliver that Mr. Grimwig was an old friend of his, and he must not mind his being a little rough in his manners. At this moment there walked into the room, supporting himself by a thick stick, a stout old gentleman.
Hello, what's that?
Said Mr. Grimwig, striking his stick upon the ground, looking at Oliver, and retreating a pace or two. This is young Oliver Twist.
Is it?
Said Mr. Grimwig at length. Mr. Brownlow, seeming to apprehend his singular friend was about to say something disagreeable, asked Oliver to step downstairs and tell Mrs. Bedwin they were ready for tea, which, as he did not half like the visitor's manner, he was very happy to do. He's a nice-looking boy, is he not? Inquired Mr. Brownlow.
I don't know,
replied Mr. Grimwig pettishly. Don't know?
No, I don't know. I never see any difference in boys. I only know 2 sorts of boys, mealy boys and beef-faced boys.
And which is Oliver?
Mealy,
snapped Mr. Grimwig. As Mr. Grimwig at tea was graciously pleased to express his entire approval of the muffins, matters went on very smoothly, and Oliver, who made one of the party, began to feel more at his ease than he had yet done in the fierce old gentleman's presence. As fate would have it, Mrs. Bedwin chanced to bring in at this moment a small parcel of books, which Mr. Brownlow had that morning purchased of the bookstall keeper, who was already figured in this history. Having laid them on the table, she prepared to leave the room. "Oh, stop the delivery boy, Mrs. Bedwin," said Mr. Brownlow. "There's something to go back." "He's gone, sir," replied Mrs. Bedwin. "Dear me, I'm very sorry for that," exclaimed Mr. Brownlow. "I particularly wished those books to be returned tonight."
Send Oliver with them,
said Mr. Grimwig with an ironical smile.
He will be sure to deliver them safely, you know.
"Oh, yes, do let me take them, if you please, sir," said Oliver. "I'll run all the way, sir."
You shall go, my dear, said Mr. Brownlow, glancing steadily at Grimwig.
"You are to say that you have brought those books back, and that you have come to pay the £4.10 I owe him. This is a £5 note, so you will have to bring me back 10 shillings change." "I won't be 10 minutes, sir," replied Oliver eagerly.
"Let me see. He'll be back in 20 minutes at the longest," said Mr. Brownlow, pulling out his watch and placing it on the table. "Oh, you really expect him to come back, do you?" inquired Mr. Grimwig.
"Don't you?" asked Mr. Brownlow, smiling.
"No," he said, smiting the table with his fist. "I do not. If ever that boy returns to this house, sir, I'll eat my head."
Oliver was walking along, thinking how happy and contented he ought to feel, when he was stopped by a pair of arms thrown tight round his neck.
"Oh, don't!" cried Oliver, struggling. "Let go of me. Who is it? What are you stopping me for?" "Why, it's Nancy."
In another moment, weak with recent illness, he was dragged into a labyrinth of dark, narrow courts and forced along them at a pace which rendered the few cries he dared to give utterance to wholly unintelligible. It was of little moment, indeed, whether they were intelligible or no, for there was nobody to care for them, had they been ever so plain. The gas lamps were lighted. Mrs. Bedwin was waiting anxiously at the open door. The servant had run up the street 20 times to see if there were any traces of Oliver, and still the two old gentlemen sat preservingly in the dark parlour. When Oliver awoke in the morning, Fagin told him that he was to be taken to the residence of Bill Sikes that night. He seemed much vexed by Oliver's not expressing any greater curiosity on the subject, but the truth is that although he felt very anxious, he was too much confused by the earnest cunning of Fagin's looks and his own speculations to make any further inquiries just then. He had no other opportunity, for the Jew remained very surly and silent till night, when he prepared to go out.
"You may burn a candle," said Fagin,
putting one upon the table,
"till they come to fetch you. Good night."
"Good night," replied Oliver softly. After the old man had left the room, Oliver remained lost in thought, with his head buried in his hands, until a rustling noise aroused him. "What's that?" he cried, starting up and catching sight of a figure standing by the door. "Who's there?" "Me. Only me," replied a tremulous voice. It was Nancy. "Am I to go with you?" asked Oliver. "Yeah, I've come from Bill," replied the girl. "You were to go with me." "What for?" said Oliver, recoiling. "Hush," said the girl. "You can't help yourself. I've tried hard for you, but all to no purpose. Give me your hand." And blowing out the light, she drew him after her up the stairs. The door was opened quickly by someone shrouded in the darkness. A hackney cabriolet was waiting. The driver wanted no directions, but lashed his horse into full speed without the delay of an instant. All was so quick and hurried that Oliver had scarcely time to recollect where he was or how he came there when the carriage stopped.
"So you've got the kid," said Sikes, when they had reached the room. "Let's have some supper and get a snooze before starting."
For a long time Oliver lay awake, until, weary with watching and anxiety, he fell asleep.
"Now then," growled Sikes as Oliver started up, "look sharp. It's late as it is."
Nancy, scarcely looking at the boy, threw him a handkerchief to tie round his throat, and Sikes gave him a large rough cape to button over his shoulders. Thus attired, Oliver gave his hand to the robber, who, merely pausing to show him with a menacing gesture that he had a pistol in a side pocket of his greatcoat, clasped it firmly in his, and exchanging a farewell with Nancy, led him away. As they passed the different milestones, Oliver wondered more and more where his companion meant to take him. Kensington, Hammersmith, Chiswick were all passed, and yet they went on steadily. They still kept walking on in mud and darkness, through gloomy lanes and over cold open wastes, until they came within sight of a solitary house, all ruinous and decayed. Sikes, with Oliver's hand still in his, softly approached the low porch and raised the latch. The door yielded to the pressure, and they passed in together. They entered a low, dark room with a smoky fire.
"Hello,"
cried a voice. A figure rose from an old couch.
"Don't make such a row, Toby,"
said Sikes. "Bill, my boy," said Toby Crackit, for that was his name. Uttering this exclamation in a tone of great surprise, as his eye rested on Oliver, Mr. Toby Crackit demanded who that was. "The boy. Only the boy," replied Sikes, drawing a chair towards the fire.
"One of Fagin's, eh?" exclaimed Toby. "What an invaluable boy that'll make!"
"Sit down by the fire," said Sikes to Oliver, "and rest yourself, for you'll have to go out with us again tonight, though not very far off."
Oliver looked at Sikes in mute and timid wonder, and drawing a stool to the fire, sat with his aching head upon his hands, scarcely knowing where he was or what was passing around him. It was intensely dark when the two robbers issued forth, with Oliver between them. After walking about a quarter of a mile, they stopped before a detached house surrounded by a wall, to the top of which Toby Crackit, scarcely pausing to take breath, climbed in a twinkling. For the first time, Oliver, well-nigh mad with grief and terror, saw that housebreaking and robbery, if not murder, were the objects of the expedition. He clasped his hands together and involuntarily uttered a subdued exclamation of horror. A mist came before his eyes. The cold sweat stood upon his ashy face. His limbs failed him, and he sank upon his knees.
"Get up," murmured Sikes, trembling with rage, and drawing the pistol from his pocket. "Get up, or I'll strew your brains upon the grass."
Oh, for God's sake, let me go," cried Oliver. "Let me run away and die in the fields. I will never come near London, never, never. Oh, pray have mercy on me, and do not make me steal. For the love of all the bright angels that rest in heaven, have mercy on me." Sikes swore a dreadful oath, and had cocked the pistol, when Toby, striking it from his grasp, placed his hand upon the boy's mouth and dragged him to the house. Sikes, invoking terrific blasphemies upon Fagin's head for sending Oliver on such an errand, plied his crowbar vigorously, but with little noise. After some delay and some assistance from Toby, the shutter swung open on its hinges. Behind the shutter was a little lattice window about 5 feet and a half above the ground at the back of the house. "Now listen, you," whispered Sikes to Oliver, drawing a dark lantern from his pocket. "I'm a going to put you through. Take this light, go softly up the steps straight afore you, and along the little hall to the street door, unfasten it, and let us in." Toby planted himself with his head against the wall. Sikes, mounting upon him, put Oliver expertly through the window with his feet first, and planted him safely on the floor inside. In the short time he had to collect his senses, Oliver had firmly resolved to dart upstairs from the hall and alarm the family. Filled with this idea, he advanced at once. "Come back!" suddenly cried Sikes aloud. "Back! Back!" Scared by the sudden breaking of the dead stillness of the place, and by a loud cry which followed it, Oliver let his lantern fall, and knew not whether to advance or fly. The cry was repeated. A light appeared. A vision of 2 terrified, half-dressed men at the top of the stairs swam before his eyes. A flash, a loud noise, a smoke, a crash somewhere, but where he knew not, and he staggered back. Sikes had him by the collar before the smoke had cleared away, and dragged the boy up. "They've hit him," said Sikes as he drew Oliver through the window. "Damnation, how the boy bleeds!" The noises grew confused, and a cold, deadly feeling crept over Oliver's heart, and he saw or heard no more.
"Wolves tear your cursed throats," muttered Sikes, grinding his teeth. "I wish I was among some of you. You'd howl the hoarser for it."
Sikes slung the body of the wounded boy across his shoulder, and turned his head for an instant to look at his pursuers. In the darkness, the loud shouting of men and the barking of neighbourhood dogs vibrated through the air. "It's all up, Bill," cried Toby. "Drop the kid and show 'em your heels." With this parting advice, Mr. Crackit fairly turned tail and darted off at full speed. Sikes clenched his teeth, took one look round, glanced at the prostrate form of Oliver, and was gone. At length the boy awoke. His left arm hung heavy and useless at his side. He looked round feebly for help, and groaned with pain. He looked about, and saw that at no great distance there was a house which perhaps he could reach. Pitying his condition, they might have compassion on him. He summoned up all his strength, and bent his faltering steps towards it. It happened that about this time Mr. Giles, Brittles, and a tinker were restoring themselves after the fatigues and terrors of the night with tea and sundries in the kitchen. Mr. Giles acted in the double capacity of butler and steward to the old lady of the mansion, and Brittles was a lad of all work, though he was something past 30. The tinker, who had been sleeping in an outhouse, had been roused by them to join the pursuit. Mr. Giles was illustrating a circumstantial and minute account of the robbery, to which his hearers, but especially the cook and housemaid, who were of the party, listened with breathless interest, when there came a knock. The cook and housemaid screamed.
"It was a knock," said Mr. Giles, assuming perfect serenity. "Open the door, somebody." Nobody moved. "It seems a strange sort of thing, a knock coming at such a time in the morning," said Mr. Giles, surveying the pale faces which surrounded him, and looking very blank himself. "But the door must be opened. Do you hear? Somebody?" Mr. Giles, as he spoke, looked at Brittles, but that young man, being naturally modest, probably considered himself nobody, and so held that the inquiry could not have any application to him. At all events, he tendered no reply. Mr. Giles directed an appealing glance at the tinker, but he had suddenly fallen asleep. The women were out of the question. "If Brittles would rather open the door in the presence of witnesses," said Mr. Giles after a short silence, "I am ready to make one." "So am I," said the tinker, waking up as suddenly as he had fallen asleep. Brittles capitulated on these terms, and the party, being somewhat reassured by the discovery made on throwing open the shutters that it was now broad day, took their way upstairs, with the dogs in front, and the two women, who were afraid to stay below, bringing up the rear. By the advice of Mr. Giles, they all talked very loud, to warn any evil-disposed person outside that they were strong in numbers, and by a master-stroke of policy, originating in the brain of the same ingenious gentleman, the dogs' tails were well pinched in the hall to make them bark savagely. These precautions having been taken, Mr. Giles held on fast by the tinker's arm to prevent his running away, as he pleasantly said, and gave the word of command to open the door. Brittles obeyed, and the group, peeping timorously over each other's shoulders, beheld no more formidable object than poor little Oliver Twist, speechless and exhausted, who raised his heavy eyes and mutely solicited their compassion. "A boy!" exclaimed Mr. Giles, valiantly pushing the tinker into the background. "Oh, what's the matter with them? Eh? Why, Brittles, look here, don't you know?" Brittles, who had got behind the door to open it, no sooner saw Oliver than he uttered a loud cry. Mr. Giles, seizing the boy by one leg and one arm, fortunately not the wounded limb, lugged him straight into the hall and deposited him at full length on the floor thereof. "Here he is!" bawled Giles, calling in a state of great excitement up the staircase. "Here's one of the thieves, ma'am. He's a thief, miss. Wounded, miss. I shot him, miss, and Brittles held the light." "In a lantern, miss," cried Brittles, applying one hand to the side of his mouth so that his voice might travel the better. The two women servants ran up the stairs to carry the intelligence that Mr. Giles had captured a robber, and the tinker busied himself in endeavouring to restore Oliver, lest he should die before he could be hanged. In the midst of all this noise and commotion, there was heard a sweet female voice, which quelled it in an instant. "Giles!" whispered the voice from the stairhead. "I'm here, miss," replied Mr. Giles. "Don't be frightened, miss. I ain't much injured. He didn't make a very desperate resistance, miss. I was soon too many for him." "Hush," replied the young lady. "You frightened my aunt almost as much as the thieves did. Is the poor creature much hurt?" "Wounded, desperate, miss," replied Giles with indescribable complacency.
"He looks as if he was a-going, miss," bawled Brittles, in the same manner as before. "Wouldn't you like to come and look at him, miss, in case he should?" "Hush, pray, there's a good man," rejoined the young lady. "Wait quietly one instant while I speak to aunt." With a footstep as soft and gentle as the voice, the speaker tripped away, and soon returned with the direction that the wounded person was to be carried carefully upstairs to Mr. Giles's room, and that Brittles was to saddle the pony and betake himself instantly to Chertsey, from which place he was to dispatch with all speed a constable and doctor. "But won't you take one look at him first, miss?" asked Mr. Giles, with as much pride as if Oliver were some bird of rare plumage that he had skilfully brought down. "Not one little peep, miss?" "Not now for the world," replied the young lady. "Poor fellow! Oh, treat him kindly, Giles, for my sake." The old servant looked up at the speaker as she turned away, with a glance as proud and admiring as if she had been his own child. Then, bending over Oliver, he helped to carry him upstairs with the care and solicitude of a woman. In a handsome room, though its furniture had rather the air of old-fashioned comfort than of modern elegance, there sat two ladies at a well-spread breakfast table. Mr. Giles, dressed with scrupulous care in a full suit of black, was in attendance upon them. He had taken his station some halfway between the sideboard and the breakfast table, and with his body drawn up to its full height, his head thrown back and inclined the merest trifle on one side, his left leg advanced and his right hand thrust into his waistcoat, while his left hung down by his side, grasping a tray, he looked like one who laboured under a very agreeable sense of his own merits and importance. Of the two ladies, one was well advanced in years, but the high-backed oaken chair in which she sat was not more upright than she. Dressed with the utmost nicety and precision in a quaint mixture of bygone costume, with some slight concessions to the prevailing taste, which rather served to point the old style pleasantly than to impair its effect, she sat in a stately manner, with her hands folded on the table before her. Her eyes, and age had dimmed but little of their brightness, were attentively fixed upon her young companion. The younger lady was in the lovely bloom and springtime of womanhood, and not past 17. A gig drove up to the garden gate, out of which there jumped a fat gentleman who ran straight into the house, burst into the room, and nearly overturned Mr. Giles and the breakfast table together. "I never heard of such a thing," exclaimed the fat gentleman. "My dear Mrs. Maylie, bless my soul, in the silence of night too, I never heard of such a thing. You ought to be dead, positively dead with fright. And you, Miss Rose," said he, turning to the young lady. "Oh, very much so indeed," said Rose, interrupting him. "But there's a poor creature upstairs whom aunt wishes you to see." "Ah, to be sure," replied the doctor, for such was the fat gentleman's profession. "That was your handiwork, Giles?" Mr. Giles, who had been feverishly putting teacups to rights, blushed very red, and said that he had that honour. The doctor was absent much longer than either he or the ladies had anticipated. At length he returned, and in reply to an anxious inquiry after his patient, looked very mysterious, and closed the door carefully. "This is a very extraordinary thing, Mrs. Maylie," said the doctor, standing with his back to the door as if to keep it shut. "Have you any objection to see him in my presence?" "If it be necessary," replied the old lady, "certainly not." "Then I think it necessary," said the doctor. They went into the room and approached the bed. Upon it, in lieu of the dogged, black-visaged ruffian they had expected to behold, there lay a mere child, worn with pain and exhaustion, and sunk into a deep sleep. "What can this mean?" exclaimed the elder lady. "This poor child can never have been the pupil of robbers." "Vice," said the surgeon, "vice takes up her abode in many temples." "Even if he had been wicked," pursued Rose, "he may never have known a mother's love. Aunt dear, for mercy's sake, think of this before you let them drag this child to a prison." "Oh, Mr. Losberne, what can I do to save him, sir?" asked Mrs. Maylie. Let me think, ma'am," said the doctor. "Let me think." In short, a neighbouring magistrate was readily induced to take the joint bail of Mrs. Maylie and Mr. Losberne for Oliver's appearance if he should ever be called upon. Meanwhile, Oliver gradually throve and prospered under the united care of Mrs. Maylie, Rose, and the kind-hearted Mr. Losberne. Oliver's ailings were neither slight nor few, and reduced him sadly. "Poor fellow," said Rose, when Oliver had been one day feebly endeavouring to utter the words of thankfulness that rose to his pale lips, "you shall have many opportunities of serving us, if you will. We are going into the country, and my aunt intends that you shall accompany us. To know that the object of her goodness and compassion was sincerely grateful and attached in consequence would delight me more than you can well imagine. Do you understand me?" she inquired, watching Oliver's thoughtful face. "Oh, yes, ma'am, yes," replied Oliver eagerly. "But I was thinking that I am ungrateful now." "To whom?" inquired the young lady. "To the kind gentleman and the dear old nurse who took so much care of me before," rejoined Oliver. "If they knew how happy I am, they would be pleased, I'm sure." "I am sure they would," rejoined Oliver's benefactress, "and Mr. Losberne has already been kind enough to promise that when you are well enough to bear the journey, he will carry you to see them." "Oh, has he, ma'am?" cried Oliver, his face brightening with pleasure. "I don't know what I shall do for joy when I see their kind faces once again." In a short time, Oliver was sufficiently recovered to undergo the fatigue of this expedition, and one morning he and Mr. Losberne set out accordingly in a little carriage which belonged to Mrs. Maylie. As Oliver knew the name of the street in which Mr. Brownlow resided, they were enabled to drive straight thither. When the coach turned into it, his heart beat so violently that he could scarcely draw his breath. "There, the White House!" cried Oliver. "Oh, pray make haste!" Oliver looked up at the windows with tears of happy expectation coursing down his face. Alas, the White House was empty, and there was a bill in the window, "To let." "Knock at the next door," cried Mr. Losberne, taking Oliver's arm in his. "What has become of Mr. Brownlow, who used to live in the adjoining house? Do you know?" The servant did not know, but would go and inquire. She presently returned and said that Mr. Brownlow had sold off his goods and gone to the West Indies 6 weeks before. Oliver clasped his hands and sank feebly backwards. This bitter disappointment caused Oliver much sorrow and grief. The circumstance occasioned no alteration, however, in the behaviour of his benefactors. After another fortnight they made preparations for quitting the house, which was at Chertsey, for some months, and repairing to a cottage at some distance in the country. It was a lovely spot to which they repaired. Oliver, whose days had been spent among squalid crowds and in the midst of noise and brawling, seemed to enter on a new existence there. So 3 months glided away. It was a happy time. The days were peaceful and serene. The nights brought with them neither fear nor care. It happened that their number in the country was augmented by the arrival of Mrs. Maylie's son. But although this happy change had a visible effect on most of the little circle, there was at times an unwonted restraint upon Rose, which Oliver could not fail to mark. Mrs. Maylie and her son were often closeted together for long periods, and more than once Rose appeared with traces of tears upon her face. At length, one morning, when Rose was alone in the breakfast parlour, Harry Maylie entered, and with some hesitation begged permission to speak with her for a few moments. A very few will suffice, Rose," said the young man, drawing his chair towards her. "What I shall have to say has already presented itself to your mind. There is no pursuit more worthy of me, more worthy of the highest nature that exists, than the struggle to win such a heart as yours," said the young man, taking her hand. "Rose, my own dear Rose, you must endeavour to forget me," Rose replied. There was a pause, during which she covered her face with one hand and gave free vent to her tears. Harry still retained the other. "And your reasons, Rose?" he said at length in a low voice. "Your reasons for this decision? You have a right to know them. In a word," said the young lady, turning away as her temporary firmness forsook her. "There is a stain upon my name, which the world visits on innocent heads. I will carry it into no blood but my own, and the reproach shall rest alone on me." "I ask one promise," said Harry. "Once, and only once more, say within a year, but it may be much sooner, let me speak to you again on this subject for the last time." "Not to press me to alter my right determination," replied Rose with a melancholy smile. "It will be useless." "No," said Harry, "to hear you repeat it, if you will, finally repeat it. If you still adhere to your present resolution, I will not seek by word or act to change it." "Then let it be so," rejoined Rose. "It is but one pang the more, and by that time I may be enabled to bear it better." She extended her hand, but the young man caught her to his bosom, and imprinting one kiss on her beautiful forehead, hurried from the room. Mr. Bumble sat in the workhouse parlour, with his eyes moodily fixed on the cheerless grate, whence, as it was summer-time, no gleam proceeded. From time to time Mr. Bumble would heave a deep sigh, whilst a more gloomy shadow overspread his countenance. For Mr. Bumble was no longer a beadle. The mighty cocked hat was replaced by a modest round one. Mr. Bumble had married Mrs. Corney, the good woman who was matron of the workhouse, and was now himself master of the workhouse. Another beadle had come into power.
"Married, and tomorrow 2 months it was done," said Mr. Bumble with a sigh. "Oh, it seems an age."
It was too much. Mr. Bumble boxed the ears of the boy who opened the gate for him, for he had reached the portal in his reverie, and walked distractedly into the street. He passed a great many public houses, and at length paused before one in a byway whose parlour was deserted, save by one solitary customer. The man who was seated there was tall and dark, and wore a large cloak. He had the air of a stranger, and seemed by a certain haggardness in his look, as well as by the dusty soils on his dress, to have travelled some distance. He eyed Mr. Bumble askance as he entered. When they had encountered each other's glances several times, the stranger broke the silence. "Are you looking for me?" he said.
"Not that I am aware of, young man."
"I have seen you before, I think," said the stranger. "You were a beadle here once, were you not?"
"Yeah, I was,"
said Mr. Bumble in some surprise. "What are you now?" asked the other.
"Master of the workhouse,"
rejoined Mr. Bumble slowly and impressively. "Now listen to me," said the stranger. "I came down to this place today to find you out, and by one of those chances which the devil throws in the way of his friends sometimes, you walked into the very room I was sitting in, while you were uppermost in my mind. I want some information from you, and I don't ask you to give it for nothing." He pushed a couple of sovereigns across the table to his companion. "Carry your memory back, let me see, 12 years last winter."
"Oh, it's a long time," said Mr. Bumble. "Very good, I've done it."
"The scene, the workhouse."
"Good."
"And the time, night."
"Yes."
"And the place, the crazy hole, wherever it was, in which miserable drabs brought forth the life and health so often denied to themselves."
"The lying-in room, I suppose,"
said Mr. Bumble, not quite following the stranger's excited description. "Yes," said the stranger. "A boy was born there, a meek-looking, pale-faced hound, who was apprenticed down here to a coffin-maker. I wish he had made his coffin and screwed his body in it, and who afterwards ran away to London, as it was supposed."
"Why, you mean Oliver? Young Twist," said Mr. Bumble. "I remember him, of course. There wasn't an obstinater young rascal."
"It's not of him I want to hear. I've heard enough of him," said the stranger. "It's of a woman, the hag that nursed his mother. Where is she?"
"Oh, she died last winter," rejoined Mr. Bumble.
The young man looked fixedly at him when he had given this information. Then he rose as if to depart. Mr. Bumble was cunning enough, and he at once saw that an opportunity was opened for the lucrative disposal of some secret in the possession of his better half. Hastily he informed the stranger that one woman had been closeted with the old harridan shortly before she died, and that she could, as he had reason to believe, throw some light on the subject of his inquiry. "How can I find her?" said the stranger, thrown off his guard.
"Only through me,"
rejoined Mr. Bumble.
"When?" cried the stranger hastily.
"Tomorrow,"
rejoined Bumble. "At 9 in the evening," said the stranger, producing a scrap of paper and writing down upon it an obscure address by the waterside, in characters that betrayed his agitation. "At 9 in the evening, bring her to me there. I needn't tell you to be secret. It's your interest." With these words he led the way to the door. On glancing at the address, the parochial functionary observed that it contained no name. The stranger had not gone far, so he made after him to ask it. "Who's that following me?" cried the man, turning quickly round as Bumble touched him on the arm.
"Only to ask a question,"
said the other, pointing to the scrap of paper.
"What name am I to ask for?"
"Monks," rejoined the man, and strode hastily away. It was a dull, close, overcast summer evening, and the clouds already yielded large drops of rain, presaged to a violent thunderstorm, when Mr. and Mrs. Bumble directed their course towards the scattered little colony of ruinous houses bordering upon the river. In the heart of this cluster of huts stood a long building formerly used as a factory of some kind.
"The place should be somewhere here,"
said Bumble, consulting a scrap of paper he held in his hand.
"Hello there!"
cried a voice from above. Following the sound, Mr. Bumble raised his head and descried a man looking out of a door breast high on the second story.
"Stand still a minute," cried the voice. "I'll be with you directly."
"Is that the man?" asked Mr. Bumble's good lady. Mr. Bumble nodded.
"Then mind what I told you," said the matron, "or you'll betray us at once."
A door opened, and Monks beckoned them inwards.
"Now," he said, "the sooner we come to our business, the better for all. The woman knows what it is, does she?" "What's it worth to you?"
asked the woman.
"It may be nothing, it may be £20, replied Monks. "Speak out, and let me know which." "25, said Mrs. Bumble, "and I'll tell you all I know."
Monks bent forward to listen to what the woman should say.
"When this nurse that we called old Sally died," the matron began, "she and I were alone. She spoke of a young creature who'd brought a child into the world some years before."
"Yes," said Monks.
"The child was the one you named to him last night," said the matron, nodding carelessly towards her husband. "And old Sally robbed the mother of this child. She stole from the corpse, when it had hardly turned to one, the very thing which the dead mother had prayed her with her last breath to keep for the infant's sake. The old hag gave me this item on her own deathbed."
"Where is it now?" asked Monks quickly.
"There,"
replied the woman, and, as if glad to be relieved of it, she hastily threw upon the table a small kid bag, which Monks, pouncing upon, tore open with trembling hands. It contained a little gold locket, in which were 2 locks of hair, and a plain gold wedding ring.
"It has the word Agnes engraved on the inside," said Mrs. Bumble. "There's a blank left for the surname, and then follows the date, which is within a year before the child was born. I found that out."
"And this is all?" said Monks, after a close and eager scrutiny of the contents of the little packet.
"All," replied Mrs. Bumble. "What do you propose to do with it?"
"This," said Monks. "See here." Suddenly Monks took the little packet and, tying it to a leaden weight, tossed it through an open window into the river. It fell straight, clove the water with a scarcely audible splash, and was gone.
"You'll keep a quiet tongue in your head, will you?" said Monks, with a threatening look.
"You may depend upon us, young man,"
answered Mr. Bumble.
"I'm glad for your sake to hear it. Here, take these sovereigns. Light your lantern, and get away from here as fast as you can."
On the evening following, a pale, slim girl by the name of Nancy, who was already figured in this tale, slipped out of the poor lodgings where she lived and headed for a distant part of London. When she reached the more wealthy quarter, which was her destination, the streets were deserted, and she found herself alone. It was a family hotel in a quiet but handsome street near Hyde Park. She loitered for a few paces, then she stepped into the hall. The porter's seat was vacant. She looked round with an air of uncertainty and advanced towards the stairs.
"Now, young woman," said a smartly dressed female looking out from a door behind her, "what do you want here?"
"A lady who is stopping at this house," answered the girl.
"A lady?" was the reply, accompanied by a scornful look. "What lady?"
"Miss Maylie,"
said Nancy.
While a message was sent above, Nancy was led to a small antechamber and told to wait. When she heard a light step approaching, she raised her eyes sufficiently to observe that the figure which presented itself was that of a slight and beautiful girl. "Tell me why you wish to see me," said Rose. "I am the person you inquired for."
"Oh, lady,
said Nancy, clasping her hands passionately before her face.
I am about to put my life and the lives of others in your hands. I am the girl that dragged little Oliver back to old Fagin's on that night he went out."
"You?" said Rose Maylie.
"Aye, lady," replied the girl. "I've stolen away from those who would surely murder me if they knew I'd been here to tell you what I have overheard. Do you know a man named Monks?"
"No," said Rose.
"He knows you," replied the girl, "and knew you were here, for it was by hearing him tell the place that I found you out."
"I never heard the name," said Rose.
"Then he goes by some other amongst us," rejoined the girl, "which I more than thought before. Some time ago, soon after Oliver was put into your house on the night of the robbery, I, suspecting this man, listened to a conversation held between him and Fagin in the dark. I found out, from what I heard, that Monks struck a bargain with Fagin that if Oliver was got back, he should have a certain sum, and he was to have more for making him a thief, which this Monks wanted for some purpose of his own. This night he came again, and I listened at the door. The first words I heard Monks say were these: 'So the only proofs of the boy's identity lie at the bottom of the river.' And then he said, with oaths common enough in my ears but strange to yours, that if he could gratify his hatred by taking the boy's life without bringing his own neck in danger, he would. In short, Fagin, he says, you never laid such snares as I'll contrive for my young brother, Oliver."
"His brother?" exclaimed Rose.
"Those were his words," said Nancy. "And more, when he spoke of you and the other lady, and said it seemed contrived by heaven or the devil that Oliver should come into your hands, he laughed and said how many hundreds of thousands of pounds would you not give, if you had 'em, to know who your two-legged spaniel was."
And with that the girl moved hurriedly towards the door. "Stay another moment," said Rose.
"You will take some money from me for this?" "Not a penny," replied the girl, waving her hand. "You would serve me best, lady, if you could take my life at once, for it would be something not to die in the same hell which I have lived. God bless you, sweet lady, and send as much happiness on your head as I have shame on mine."
Thus speaking and sobbing aloud, the unhappy creature turned away, while Rose Maylie, overpowered by this extraordinary interview, sank into a chair. Disturbed by different reflections, inclining now to one course, now to another, Rose passed a sleepless and anxious night. After more communing with herself, next day she arrived at the desperate conclusion of consulting Harry. She had taken up the same pen and laid it down again 50 times, and had considered and reconsidered the first line of her letter without writing the first word, when Oliver, who had been walking in the streets with Mr. Giles for a bodyguard, entered the room in such breathless haste and violent agitation as seemed to betoken some new cause of alarm.
I've seen the gentleman," said Oliver, scarcely able to articulate. "The gentleman who was so good to me, Mr. Brownlow, that we've so often talked about."
"Where?" asked Rose.
"Getting out of a coach," replied Oliver, "and going into a house. I didn't speak to him. I trembled so that I was not able to go up to him. But Giles asked for me whether he lived there, and they said he did. Look here," said Oliver, opening a scrap of paper. "Here it is. Here's where he lives." "Quick," Rose said. "Tell them to fetch a hackney coach and be ready to go with me. I will take you there directly." Oliver needed no prompting to dispatch, and in little more than 5 minutes they were on their way. When they arrived, Rose left Oliver in the coach under pretence of preparing the old gentleman to receive him, and sending up her card by the servant, requested to see Mr. Brownlow on very pressing business. The servant soon returned to beg that she would walk upstairs, and following him into an upper room, Miss Maylie was presented to an elderly gentleman of benevolent appearance, and another who was seated near him. "Mr. Brownlow, I believe, sir," said Rose.
"That is my name," said the old gentleman. "This is my friend, Mr. Grimwig. Grimwig, will you leave us for a few minutes?"
"I believe," interposed Miss Maylie, "that at this period of our interview I need not give that gentleman the trouble of going away. If I am correctly informed, he is cognizant of the business on which I wish to speak to you."
Mr. Brownlow inclined his head. Mr. Grimwig made one very stiff bow.
"I shall surprise you very much, I have no doubt," said Rose, naturally embarrassed. "But you once showed great benevolence and goodness to a very dear young friend of mine."
"Indeed?" said Mr. Brownlow.
"Oliver Twist, you knew him as?" replied Rose. The words no sooner escaped her lips than over Mr. Grimwig's face there came an expression of unmitigated wonder. Mr. Brownlow was no less surprised. "Miss Maylie," said Mr. Brownlow, "will you let me know what intelligence you have of this poor child?" Rose at once related, in a few natural words, all that had befallen Oliver since he left Mr. Brownlow's house, excepting that she reserved Nancy's information for that gentleman's private ear.
"Thank God," said the old gentleman. "This is great happiness to me, great happiness. But you have not told me where he is now, Miss Maylie."
"He is waiting in a coach at the door," replied Rose.
"At this door?" cried the old gentleman, with which he hurried out of the room without another word. He returned accompanied by Oliver, whom Mr. Grimwig received very graciously. "There is somebody else who should not be forgotten, by the by," said Mr. Brownlow, ringing the bell. "Send Mrs. Bedwin here, if you please." The old housekeeper answered the summons with all dispatch, and dropping a curtsy at the door, waited for orders. The next instant she recognized Oliver, who sprang into her arms. "God be good to me," cried the old lady, embracing him. "It is my innocent boy, my dear old nurse," cried Oliver. Leaving her and Oliver to compare notes at leisure, Mr. Brownlow led the way into another room, and there heard from Rose a full narration of her interview with Nancy, which occasioned him no little surprise and perplexity. Rose also explained her reasons for not confiding in her friend Mr. Losberne in the first instance. The old gentleman considered that she had acted prudently, and readily undertook to hold solemn conference with the worthy doctor himself. It was arranged that he should call at the hotel at 8 o'clock that evening, and that in the meantime Mrs. Maylie should be cautiously informed of all that had occurred. These preliminaries adjusted, Rose and Oliver returned towards their hotel. Rose had by no means overrated the measure of the good doctor's wrath. That evening Nancy's history was no sooner unfolded to him than he poured forth a shower of mingled threats and execrations.
"Then what the devil is to be done?" said the impetuous doctor. "Are we to pass a vote of thanks to all these vagabonds, male and female, and beg them to accept £100 or so apiece?"
"We must proceed gently, with great care," said Mr. Brownlow.
"Gentleness and care!" exclaimed the doctor. "I'd send them one and all to—"
"Never mind where," interposed Mr. Brownlow, "but reflect whether sending them anywhere is likely to attain the object we have in view."
"What object?"
asked the doctor. "Simply the discovery of Oliver's parentage, and regaining for him the inheritance of which, if this story be true, he has been fraudulently deprived."
"Ah," said Mr. Losberne,
"It is quite clear that we shall have extreme difficulty in getting to the bottom of this mystery," pursued Mr. Brownlow, "unless we can bring this man Monks upon his knees. I should like to call in the aid of my friend Grimwig. He is a strange creature, but a shrewd one, and might prove of material assistance to us." I have no objection to your calling in your friend, if I may call in mine, said the doctor. We must put it to the vote, replied Mr. Brownlow. Who may he be? That lady's son, and this young lady's very old friend, said the doctor, motioning towards Mrs. Maylie, and concluding with an expressive glance at her niece. Rose blushed deeply, but she did not make any audible objection to this motion. Possibly she felt in a hopeless minority. And Harry Maylie and Mr. Grimwig were accordingly added to the committee. It was Sunday night, and the bell of the church struck the hour. Sikes and Fagin were talking, but they paused to listen. Nancy looked up from the low seat on which she crouched and listened too.
An hour this side of midnight, said Sikes. Dark and heavy it is too. A good night for business, this.
That's the way to talk, my dear,
replied Fagin, patting him on the shoulder.
It does me good to hear you.
I don't like it when you lay that withered old claw on my shoulder, so take it away, said Sikes, casting off the hand.
It makes you nervous, Bill. Reminds you of being nabbed, does it?
said Fagin.
Reminds me of being nabbed by the devil, returned Sikes.
Fagin offered no reply to this compliment, but pulling Sikes by the sleeve, pointed his finger towards Nancy, who had taken advantage of the conversation to put on her bonnet, and was now leaving the room.
"Hello," cried Sikes. "Nance, where's the girl going to at this time of night?"
Not far.
"What answer is that?" returned Sikes. "Where you going?"
I am not well, rejoined the girl. I want a breath of fresh air.
"Well, put your head out the window," replied Sikes.
There's not enough there, said the girl. I want it in the street.
"Then you won't have it," replied Sikes.
With which assurance he rose, locked the door, took the key out, and pulling her bonnet from her head, flung it to the top of an old press.
Let me go,
said the girl with great earnestness. Then, sitting herself down on the floor before the door, she said,
Bill, let me go. You don't know what you're doing.
"Cut my limbs off one by one," cried Sikes, seizing her roughly by the arm, "if I don't think the girl's stark raving mad. Get up."
Not till you let me go! Not till you let me go!
Screamed the girl. Sikes looked on, watching for his opportunity, and suddenly, pinioning her hands, dragged her, struggling and wrestling with him by the way, into a small room adjoining, where he sat himself on a bench, and thrusting her into a chair, held her down by force. She struggled and implored by turns, until 12 o'clock had struck, and then, wearied and exhausted, ceased to contest the point any further. With a caution backed by many oaths to make no more efforts to go out that night, Sikes left her to recover at leisure, and rejoined Fagin.
"Whoa,"
said the housebreaker, wiping the perspiration from his face.
"What a precious strange gal that is."
You may say that, Bill,
replied Fagin thoughtfully.
You may say that.
"What is she taking into her head to go out tonight for, do you think?" asked Sikes.
Obstinacy. Woman's obstinacy, I suppose, my dear.
"Well, I suppose it is," growled Sikes. "I thought I'd tamed her, but she's as bad as ever."
Fagin took up his hat and bade him good night. He paused when he reached the room door, and looking round asked if somebody would light him down the dark stairs.
"Light him down," said Sikes, who was filling his pipe. "It's a pity he should break his neck himself and disappoint the sightseers. Show him a light."
Nancy followed the old man downstairs with a candle. When they reached the passage, he laid his finger on his lip, and drawing close to the girl, said in a whisper,
What is it, Nancy, dear?
"What do you mean?" replied the girl in the same tone.
The reason of all this,
replied Fagin.
If
he pointed with his skinny forefinger up the stairs.
If he is so hard with you, he's a brute, Nance, a brute beast. Why don't you?
Well, said the girl as Fagin paused, with his mouth almost touching her ear and his eyes looking into hers.
No matter just now. We'll talk of this again. You have a friend in me, Nance, a staunch friend. I have the means at hand, quiet and close. If you want revenge on those that treat you like a dog, worse than his dog, for he humours him sometimes, come to me. I say, come to me. He is the mere hound of a day. But you know me of old, Nance.
I know you well, replied the girl, without manifesting the least emotion. Good night. Fagin was up betimes next morning, and waited impatiently for the appearance of his new associate, Noah Claypole, who had absconded from the coffin-makers and come to London. After a delay that seemed interminable, Noah at length presented himself and commenced a voracious assault on the breakfast.
"Well, here I am," said Noah. "What's the matter? Don't ask me to do anything till I've done eating. That's a great fault in this place. You never get enough time over your meals."
"You can talk as you eat, can't you?"
said Fagin, cursing his dear young friend's greediness from the very bottom of his heart.
"Oh, yeah, I can talk. I get on better when I talk," said Noah, cutting a monstrous slice of bread.
"I want you," said Fagin, leaning over the table, "to do a piece of work for me, my dear, that needs great care and caution. There's not the smallest danger in it. It's only to dodge a woman."
"What'll you give me?"
asked Noah, setting down his cup and looking his new employer eagerly in the face.
"If you do it well, £1, my dear. £1,
said Fagin, wishing to interest him in the cent as much as possible.
"And that's what I never gave yet for any job of work where there wasn't valuable consideration to be gained."
"Who is she?"
inquired Noah.
"One of us."
"Oh, law,"
cried Noah, curling up his nose.
"you're doubtful of her, aren't you?"
"She has found out some new friends, my dear, and I must know who they are,"
replied Fagin. The church clocks chimed 11:15 as two figures emerged on London Bridge. One, which advanced with a swift and rapid step, was that of a woman, who looked eagerly about her as though in quest of some expected object. The other figure was that of a man, who slunk along in the deepest shadow he could find, stopping when she stopped, and as she moved again, creeping stealthily on. The girl had taken a few restless turns to and fro, closely watched meanwhile by her hidden and therefore unseen observer, when the heavy bell of St. Paul's tolled for the death of another day. The hour had not struck 2 minutes when a young lady, accompanied by a grey-haired gentleman, alighted from a hackney carriage within a short distance of the bridge, and having dismissed the vehicle, walked straight towards it. They had scarcely set foot upon its pavement when the girl started and immediately made towards them.
"Not here," said Nancy hurriedly. "I'm afraid to speak to you here. Come away, out of the public road, down the steps yonder."
Her shadow drew himself straight upright against the wall, and scarcely breathing, listened attentively.
"This is far enough," said the gentleman. "This young lady," the gentleman began, "has communicated to me and to some other friends who can be safely trusted what you told her nearly a fortnight since. I confess to you that I had doubts at first whether you were to be implicitly relied upon, but now I firmly believe you are."
"I am,"
said the girl.
"Then," said the gentleman, "put Monks into my hands and leave him to me to deal with."
"And Monks would never learn it was me as told you?" said the girl after a short pause.
"Never," replied the gentleman. "The intelligence should be so brought to bear upon him that he could never even guess."
"He is tall," said the girl, "and a strongly made man, but not stout. His lips are often discoloured and disfigured with the marks of teeth, for he has desperate fits, and sometimes even bites his hands and covers them with wounds. Why did you start?" said the girl, stopping suddenly.
The gentleman replied in a hurried manner that he was not conscious of having done so, and begged her to proceed.
"Upon his throat," said the girl, "so high that you can see a part of it below his neckerchief when he turns his face, there is—"
"A broad red mark like a burn or scald?" cried the gentleman.
"How's this?" said the girl. "You know him?"
The young lady uttered a cry of surprise, and for a few moments they were so still that the listener could distinctly hear them breathe.
"I think I do," said the gentleman, breaking silence. I should, by your description. We shall see. Many people are singularly like each other. It may not be the same. As he expressed himself to this effect with assumed carelessness, he took a step or two nearer the concealed spy, as the latter could tell from the distinctness with which he heard him mutter, "It must be he." After the girl had imparted yet further information concerning her wretched life and company, Rose Maylie lingered, but the old gentleman drew her arm through his and led her with gentle force away. As they disappeared, the girl sunk down nearly at her full length upon one of the stone stairs and vented the anguish of her heart in bitter tears. Peeping out more than once when he reached the top of the stairs to make sure that he was unobserved, Noah Claypole darted away at his utmost speed and made for Fagin's house as fast as his legs would carry him. Fagin sat watching in his old lair, with face so distorted and pale and eyes so red and bloodshot that he looked less like a man than like some hideous phantom. Stretched upon a mattress on the floor lay Noah Claypole, fast asleep. Towards him the old man sometimes directed his eyes for an instant, and then brought them back again to the candle, which, with a long burnt wick drooping almost double, and hot grease falling down in clots upon the table, plainly showed that his thoughts were busy elsewhere. The bell rang gently. Fagin crept upstairs to the door, and presently returned, accompanied by Sikes.
"There," said Bill, laying the bundle on the table. "Take care of that and do the most you can with it. It's been trouble enough to get. I thought I should have been here 3 hours ago."
Fagin looked hard at the robber, and motioning him to be silent, stooped over the bed upon the floor and shook the sleeper to rouse him.
"Tell me that again. Once again, just for him to hear,"
said Fagin, pointing to Sikes as he spoke.
"What? Tell you what?" asked the sleepy Noah, shaking himself pettishly.
"Tell about Nancy,"
said Fagin, clutching Sikes by the wrist, as if to prevent his leaving the house before he had heard enough.
"You followed her?"
"Yeah."
"To London Bridge?"
"Yeah."
"Where she met 2 people?"
"So she did."
"A gentleman and a lady that she'd gone to of her own accord before, who asked her to give away all her pals and monks first, which she did, and to describe him, which she did, and to tell her what house it was that we meet at and go to, which she did, and where it could best be watched from, which she did, and what time the people went there, which she did. She did all this. She told it all, every word, without a threat, without a murmur. She did she not?"
cried Fagin, half mad with fury.
"Hell's fire!"
cried Sikes, breaking fiercely from Fagin.
"Let me go!"
Flinging the old man from him, he rushed from the room and darted wildly and furiously up the stairs.
"Bill! Bill!" cried Fagin, following him hastily. "A word, only a word."
The word would not have been exchanged but that the housebreaker was unable to open the door, on which he was expending fruitless oaths and violence, when the Jew came panting up.
"Let me out," said Sikes. "Don't speak to me. It's not safe. Let me out, I say."
"Hear me speak a word,"
rejoined Fagin, laying his hand upon the lock.
"You won't be—"
"Well," replied the other.
"You won't be too violent, Bill?"
The day was breaking, and there was light enough for the men to see each other's faces. They exchanged one brief glance. There was a fire in the eyes of both, which could not be mistaken.
"I mean,"
said Fagin, showing that he felt all disguise was now useless,
"I mean, not too violent for safety. Be crafty, Bill, and not too bold."
Sikes made no reply, but pulling open the door, of which Fagin had turned the lock, dashed into the silent streets. Without one pause or moment's consideration, without once turning his head to the right or left, or raising his eyes to the sky, or lowering them to the ground, but looking straight before him with savage resolution, his teeth so tightly compressed that the strained jaws seemed starting through his skin, the robber held on his headlong course, nor muttered a word, nor relaxed a muscle, until he reached his own door. He opened it softly with a key, strode lightly up the stairs, and entering his own room, double-locked the door, and lifting a heavy table against it, drew back the curtain of the bed. The girl was lying half-dressed upon it. He had roused her from her sleep, for she raised herself with a hurried and startled look.
"Get up,"
said the man.
"Oh, It is you, Bill, said the girl with an expression of pleasure at his return.
It is, was the reply. Get up.
There was a candle burning, but the man hastily drew it from the candlestick and hurled it under the grate. Seeing the faint light of early day without, the girl rose to undraw the curtain.
Let it be,
said Sikes, thrusting his hand before her.
There's light enough for what I've got to do.
Oh, Bill, said the girl in the low voice of alarm, why do you look like that at me?
The robber sat regarding her for a few seconds, with dilated nostrils and heaving breast, and then, grasping her by the head and throat, dragged her into the middle of the room, and looking once towards the door, placed his heavy hand upon her mouth.
Oh, Bill, Bill, gasped the girl, wrestling with the strength of mortal fear. I won't scream or cry. Not once. Hear me. Speak to me. Tell me what I have done.
You know, you she-devil, returned the robber, suppressing his breath. You were watched tonight. Every word you said was heard.
Then spare my life, for the love of heaven, as I spared yours, rejoined the girl, clinging to him. Bill, dear Bill, you cannot have the heart to kill me. Oh, think of all I've given up, only this one night for you. You shall have time to think and save yourself this crime. I will not loose my hold. You cannot throw me off, Bill. Bill, for dear God's sake, for your own, for mine, stop before you spill my blood. I have been true to you. Upon my guilty soul I have.
The man struggled violently to release his arms, but those of the girl were clasped round his, and tear as he would, he could not tear them away.
Bill, oh, Bill, cried the girl, striving to lay her head upon his breast. The gentleman and that dear lady told me tonight of a home in some foreign country where I could end my days in solitude and peace. Let me see them again, and beg them on my knees to show the same mercy and goodness to you, and let us both leave this dreadful place, and far apart lead better lives, and forget how we have lived, except in prayers, and never see each other more. It is never too late to repent. They told me so. I feel it now. But we must have time. A little time.
The housebreaker freed one arm and grasped his pistol. The certainty of immediate detection if he fired flashed across his mind, even in the midst of his fury, and he beat it twice with all the force he could summon upon the upturned face that almost touched his own. She staggered and fell, nearly blinded with the blood that rained down from a deep gash in her forehead, but raising herself with difficulty on her knees, drew from her bosom a white handkerchief, Rose Maylie's own, that she had given her, and holding it up in her folded hands, as high towards heaven as her feeble strength would allow, breathed one prayer for mercy to her Maker. It was a ghastly figure to look upon. The murderer, staggering backward to the wall, and shutting out the sight with his hand, seized a heavy club and struck her down. Of all bad deeds that under cover of the darkness had been committed within wide London's bounds since night hung over it, that was the worst. Of all the horrors that rose with an ill scent upon the morning air, that was the foulest and most cruel. He tried to shut it out, but it would stream in. If the sight had been a ghastly one in the dull morning, what was it now in all that brilliant light? There had been a moan and motion of the hand, and with terror added to rage he had struck and struck again. Once he threw a rug over it, but it was worse to fancy the eyes and imagine them moving towards him than to see them glaring upward, as if watching the reflection of the pool of gore that quivered and danced in the sunlight on the ceiling. He had plucked it off again, and there was the body, mere flesh and blood, no more, but such flesh and so much blood. He struck a light, kindled a fire, and thrust the club into it. The twilight was beginning to close in when Mr. Brownlow alighted from a hackney coach at his own door and knocked softly. The door being opened, a sturdy man got out of the coach and stationed himself on one side of the steps, while another man, who had been seated on the box, dismounted too and stood upon the other side. At a sign from Mr. Brownlow, they helped out a third man, and taking him between them, hurried him into the house. This man was Monks.
"By what authority am I kidnapped in the street and brought here by these dogs?" asked Monks, looking from one to other of the men who stood beside him.
"By mine," replied Mr. Brownlow.
"This is pretty treatment, sir," said Monks, throwing down his hat and cloak. "From my father's oldest friend."
"It is because I was your father's oldest friend that I am moved to treat you gently now. Yes, Edward Leaford, even now, and blush for your unworthiness who bear the name. You have a brother," said Mr. Brownlow. "A brother, the whisper of whose name in your ear when I came behind you in the street was in itself almost enough to make you accompany me hither in wonder and alarm."
"I have no brother," replied Monks. "You know I was an only child. Why do you talk to me of brothers? You know that as well as I."
"Attend to what I do know, and you may not," said Mr. Brownlow. "I shall interest you by and by. I know that of the wretched marriage into which family pride and the most sordid and narrowest of all ambition forced your unhappy father when a mere boy, you were the sole and most unnatural issue."
"Well, they were separated," said Monks. "And what of that?"
"When they had been separated for some time," returned Mr. Brownlow, "and your mother, wholly given up to continental frivolities, had utterly forgotten the young husband, 10 good years her junior, who, with prospects blighted, lingered on at home, he fell among new friends. These new friends, then," said Mr. Brownlow, "were a naval officer retired from active service, whose wife had died some half a year before, and left him with 2 children, both daughters, one a beautiful creature of 19, and the other a mere child of 2 or 3 years old. Acquaintance, intimacy, friendship fast followed on each other. Your father was gifted as few men are. As the old officer knew him more and more, he grew to love him. I would that it ended there. His daughter did the same. The end of a year found your father solemnly contracted, to that daughter, the object of the first, true, ardent, only passion of a guileless, untried girl."
"Your tale is of the longest," observed Monks, moving restlessly in his chair.
"It is a true tale of grief and trial and sorrow, young man," returned Mr. Brownlow, "and such tales usually are. If it were one of unmixed joy and happiness, it would be very brief. At length, one of those rich relations, to strengthen whose interest and importance your father had been sacrificed, as others are often, it is no uncommon case, died, and to repair the misery he had been instrumental in occasioning, left your father his panacea for all griefs, money. It was necessary that he should immediately repair to Rome, whither this man had sped for health, and where he had died, leaving his affairs in great confusion. Your father went, was seized with mortal illness there, was followed the moment the intelligence reached Paris by your mother, who carried you with her. Your father died the day after her arrival. Before he went abroad, and as he passed through London on his way," said Mr. Brownlow slowly, and fixing his eyes upon the other's face, "he came to me."
"I never heard of that," interrupted Monks in a tone intended to appear incredulous, but savouring more of disagreeable surprise.
The old gentleman paused. Monks was biting his lips, with his eyes fixed upon the floor. Seeing this, he immediately resumed.
"He came to me, and left with me, among some other things, a picture, a portrait painted by himself, a likeness of this poor girl, which he did not wish to leave behind, and could not carry forward on his hasty journey. He was worn by anxiety and remorse almost to a shadow, talked in a wild, distracted way of ruin and dishonor worked by him, confided to me his intention to convert his whole property at any loss into money, and having settled on his estranged wife and you a portion of his recent acquisition, to fly the country. I guessed too well he would not fly alone. Even from me, his old and early friend, even from me, he withheld any more particular confession, promising to write and tell me all, and after that to see me once again for the last time on earth. Alas, that was the last time. I had no letter, and I never saw him more. I went, said Mr. Brownlow after a short pause, I went, when all was over, to the scene of his, I will use the term the world would freely use, for worldly harshness or favour are now alike to him, the scene of his guilty love. Resolved that if my fears were realized, that erring child should find one heart and home to shelter and compassionate her. The family had left that part a week before. They had called in such trifling debts as were outstanding, discharged them, and left the place by night. Why or whither, none can tell. Monks drew his breath yet more freely, and looked round with a smile of triumph. When your brother, said Mr. Brownlow, drawing nearer to the other's chair, when your brother, a feeble, ragged, neglected child, was cast in my way by a stronger hand than chance, and rescued by me from a life of vice and infamy. What? Cried Monks. By me, said Mr. Brownlow. I told you I should interest you before long. I say by me. I see that your cunning associate suppressed my name, although for aught he knew it would be quite strange to your ears. When your brother was rescued by me, then, and lay recovering from sickness in my house, his strong resemblance to this picture I have spoken of struck me with astonishment. Even when I first saw him in all his dirt and misery, there was a lingering expression in his face that came upon me like a glimpse of some old friend flashing on one in a vivid dream. I need not tell you he was snared away before I knew his history. Why not? Asked Monks hastily. Because you know it well. I? Denial to me is vain, replied Mr. Brownlow. I shall show you that I know more than that. You can't prove anything against me, stammered Monks. I defy you to do it. We shall see, returned the old gentleman with a searching glance. I lost the boy, and no efforts of mine could recover him. Your mother being dead, I knew that you alone could solve the mystery, if anybody could. And, as when I had last heard of you, you were on your own estate in the West Indies, whither, as you well know, you retired upon your mother's death to escape the consequences of vicious courses here, I made the voyage. You had left it months before, and were supposed to be in London, but no one could tell where. I returned. I paced the streets by night and day, but until 2 hours ago all my efforts were fruitless, and I never saw you for an instant. And now you do see me, said Monks, rising boldly. What then? Fraud and robbery are high-sounding words, justified, you think, by a fancied resemblance in some young imp to an idle daub of a dead man. Brother, you don't even know that a child was born of this maudlin pair. You don't even know that. I did not, replied Mr. Brownlow, rising too, but within the last fortnight I have learnt it all. You have a brother. You know it, and him. There was a will which your mother destroyed, leaving the secret and the gain to you at her own death. It contained a reference to some child likely to be the result of this sad connection, which child was born and accidentally encountered by you when your suspicions were first awakened by his resemblance to your father. You repaired to the place of his birth. There existed proofs long suppressed, of his birth and parentage. Those proofs were destroyed by you. And now, in your own words to your accomplice, the Jew, the only proofs of the boy's identity lie at the bottom of the river. Unworthy son, coward, liar, You who hold your councils with thieves and murderers in dark rooms at night, you whose plots and wiles have brought a violent death upon the head of one worth millions such as you who from your cradle were all and bitterness to your own father's heart, you in whom all evil passions, vice, profligacy festered till they found a vent in a hideous disease which has made your face an index even to your mind. You, Edward Leaford, do you still brave me?
No, returned the coward, overwhelmed by these accumulated charges.
Every word, cried the old gentleman, every word that has passed between you and this detested villain is known to me. Shadows on the wall have caught your whispers and brought them to my ear. The sight of the persecuted child has turned vice itself and given it the courage and almost the attributes of virtue. Murder has been done to which you were morally, if not really, a party.
No, interposed Monks. I know nothing of that. I was going to inquire the truth of the story when you overtook me. I didn't know the cause. I thought it was a common quarrel.
It was the partial disclosure of your secrets, replied Mr. Brownlow. Will you disclose the whole?
Yes, I will.
Set your hand to a statement of truth and facts, and repeat it before witnesses.
That I promise too.
Remain quietly here until such a document is drawn up, and proceed with me to such a place as I may deem most advisable for the purpose of attesting it.
If you insist upon that, I'll do that also, replied Monks.
You must do more than that, said Mr. Brownlow. Make restitution to an innocent and unoffending child, for such he is, although the offspring of a guilty and most miserable love. You have not forgotten the provisions of the will. Carry them into execution so far as your brother is concerned, and then go where you please. In this world you need meet no more.
While Monks was pacing up and down, meditating with dark and evil looks on this proposal and the possibilities of evading it, torn by his fears on the one hand and his hatred on the other, the door was hurriedly unlocked, and a gentleman, Mr. Losberne, entered the room in violent agitation. "The man will be taken," he cried. "He will be taken tonight."
"The murderer?"
asked Mr. Brownlow. Yes.
"The Jew?" said Mr. Brownlow.
"What of him?" "When I last heard, he had not been taken, but he will be or is by this time. They're sure of him."
"Have you made up your mind?" asked Mr. Brownlow in a low voice of Monks.
"Yes," he replied. You will be secret with me?"
"I will. Remain here till I return. It is your only hope of safety."
They left the room, and the door was again locked. "What have you done?" asked the doctor in a whisper.
"All that I could hope to do, and even more. Coupling the poor girl's intelligence with my previous knowledge, and the result of our good friend's inquiries on the spot, I left him no loophole of escape, and laid bare the whole villainy which, by these lights, became plain as day. Write and appoint the evening after tomorrow at 7 for the meeting. We shall be down there a few hours before, but shall require rest, especially the young lady, who may have greater need of firmness than either you or I can quite foresee just now. But my blood boils to avenge this poor murdered creature. Which way have they taken?"
"Drive straight to the office, and you will be in time," replied Mr. Losberne. "I will remain here." The two gentlemen hastily separated, each in a fever of excitement wholly uncontrollable. Near to that part of the Thames on which the church at Rotherhithe abuts, the buildings on the banks are dirtiest, and the vessels on the river blackest with the dust of colliers and the smoke of close-built, low-roofed houses. In an upper room of one of these houses there were assembled 3 men. One of these was Toby Crackit, another a Mr. Chitling, and the third a robber of 50 years, whose nose had been almost beaten in, and whose face bore a frightful scar which might probably be traced to the same occasion. This man was a returned transport, and his name was Caggs. Toby Crackit turned to Chitling and said, "Then was Fagin took then?" "Just at dinner time, 2 o'clock this afternoon." Suddenly was heard a hurried knocking at the door below. Crackit went down to the door and returned, followed by a man with the lower part of his face buried in a handkerchief and another tied over his head under his hat. He drew them slowly off.
Blanched face, sunken eyes, hollow cheeks, beard of 3 days' growth, wasted flesh, short, thick breath. It was the very ghost of Sikes. His hollow voice broke the silence. "Tonight's papers say that Fagin's took. Is it true or a lie?"
"True."
They were silent again.
"Damn you all," said Sikes, passing his hand across his forehead. "Have you nothing to say to me?"
There was an uneasy movement among them, but nobody spoke.
"Who's that knocking?"
cried Sikes. Crackit intimated by a motion of his hand as he left the room that there was nothing to fear, and directly came back with Charlie Bates behind him. Sikes sat opposite the door, so that the moment the boy entered the room he encountered his figure.
"Toby,"
said the boy, falling back as Sikes turned his eyes towards him.
"Why didn't you tell me this downstairs?"
"Charlie," said Sikes, stepping forward, Don't you know me?"
"Don't come near,"
answered the boy, still retreating, and looking with horror in his eyes upon the murderer's face.
"You monster!"
Crackit pulled him back with a look of alarm and pointed to the window. There were lights gleaming below, voices in loud and earnest conversation, the tramp of hurried footsteps, endless they seemed in number, crossing the nearest wooden bridge. The gleam of lights increased. The footsteps came more thickly and noisily on. Then came a loud knocking at the door, and then a hoarse murmur from such a multitude of angry voices as would have made the boldest quail.
"Help! Help!"
shrieked the boy in a voice that rent the air.
"He's here! Break down the door!"
"In the King's name!"
cried voices without, and the hoarse cry arose again, but louder.
"Damn you!"
cried the desperate villain, throwing up the sash and menacing the crowd.
"Do your worst. I'll cheat you yet."
Of all the terrific yells that ever fell on mortal ears, none could exceed the cry of the infuriated throng.
"The tide!"
cried the murderer as he staggered back into the room and shut the faces out.
"The tide was in as I came up. Give me a rope, a long rope. They're all in front. I may drop into the folly ditch and clear off that way. Give me a rope, or I shall do 3 more murders and kill myself at last."
The panic-stricken men pointed to where such articles were kept. The murderer, hastily selecting the longest and strongest cord, hurried up to the housetop. The water was out, and the ditch a bed of mud. The murderer set his foot against the stack of chimneys, fastened one end of the rope tightly and firmly round it, and with the other made a strong running noose by the aid of his hands and teeth almost in a second. He could let himself down by the cord to within a less distance of the ground than his own height, and had his knife ready in his hand to cut it then and drop. At the very instant when he brought the loop over his head, previous to slipping it beneath his armpits, he lost his balance and tumbled over the parapet. The noose was at his neck. He fell for 35 feet. There was a sudden jerk, a terrific convulsion of the limbs, and there he hung, with the open knife clenched in his stiffening hand. The events narrated in the last chapter were yet but 2 days old when Oliver found himself at 3 o'clock in the afternoon in a travelling carriage rolling fast towards his native town. Mrs. Maylie and Rose and Mrs. Bedwin and the good doctor were with him, and Mr. Brownlow followed in a post-chaise, accompanied by one other person whose name had not been mentioned. They drove straight to the door of the chief hotel, and here was Mr. Grimwig ready to receive them. There was dinner prepared, and there were bedrooms ready, and everything was arranged as if by magic. At length, when 9 o'clock had come, Mr. Losberne and Mr. Grimwig entered the room, followed by Mr. Brownlow, and a man whom Oliver almost shrieked with surprise to see, for they told him it was his brother. Monks cast a look of hate, which even then he could not dissemble, at the astonished boy, and sat down near the door. Mr. Brownlow, who had papers in his hand, walked to a table near which Rose and Oliver were seated.
"This is a painful task," said he, "but these declarations, which have been signed in London before many gentlemen, must be in substance repeated here. I would have spared you the degradation, but we must hear them from your own lips before we part, and you know why."
"Go on,"
said the person addressed, turning away his face. "Quick, I've almost done enough, I think. Don't keep me here."
"This child," said Mr. Brownlow, drawing Oliver to him and laying his hand upon his head, "is your half-brother, the illegitimate son of your father, my dear friend Edwin Leaford, by poor young Agnes Fleming, who died in giving him birth."
"Yes, that is their bastard child."
"The term you use," said Mr. Brownlow sternly, "is a reproach to those who long since passed beyond the feeble censure of the world. It reflects disgrace on no one living, except you who use it. Let that pass. He was born in this town?"
"In the workhouse of this town," was the sullen reply. "You have the story there." He pointed impatiently to the papers as he spoke.
"I must have it here, too,"
said Mr. Brownlow, looking round upon the listeners. They all paid the closest attention as Monks recited in detail the true history of Oliver's family. When at last Monks concluded his tale, it was Mr. Brownlow who spoke first, as he turned to Rose.
"Young lady," he said gently, "give me your hand. Do not tremble. You need not fear to hear the few remaining words we have to say."
"If they have, I do not know how they can, but if they have any reference to me," said Rose, "pray let me hear them at some other time. I have not strength of spirits now."
"Nay," returned the old gentleman, drawing her arm through his, "you have more fortitude than this, I am sure. Do you know this young lady, sir?"
"Yes," replied Monks.
"I never saw you before," said Rose faintly.
"I have seen you often," returned Monks.
"The father of the unhappy Agnes had 2 daughters," said Mr. Brownlow. "What was the fate of the other, the child?"
"The child," replied Monks, "when her father died in a strange place and a strange name, without a letter, book, or scrap of paper that yielded the faintest clue by which his friends or relatives could be traced, the child was taken by some wretched cottagers who reared it as their own." "Go on," said Mr. Brownlow, signing to Mrs. Maylie to approach. "Go on." "You couldn't find the spot to which these people had repaired," said Monks, "but where friendship fails, hatred will often force a way. My mother found it after a year of cunning search. Aye, and found the child."
"She took it, did she?"
"No. The people were poor, and began to sicken, at least the man did, of their fine humanity. So she left it with them, giving them a small present of money, which would not last long, and promising more, which she never meant to send. She didn't quite rely, however, on their discontent and poverty for the child's unhappiness, but told the history of the sister's shame, with such alterations as suited her, bade them take good heed of the child, for she came of bad blood, and told them she was illegitimate and sure to go wrong at one time or another. The circumstances countenanced all this, the people believed it, and there the child dragged on an existence miserable enough even to satisfy us, until a widow lady residing then at Chester saw the girl by chance, pitied her, and took her home. There was some cursed spell, I think, against us, for in spite of all our efforts, she remained there and was happy. I lost sight of her 2 or 3 years ago, and saw her no more until a few months back."
"Do you see her now?"
"Yes, leaning on your arm." "But not the less my niece," cried Mrs. Maylie, folding the fainting girl in her arms. "Not the less my dearest child. I would not lose her now for all the treasures of the world. My sweet companion, my own dear girl." "The only friend I ever had," said Rose, clinging to her. "The kindest, best of friends. Oh, my heart will burst. I cannot bear all this." "You have borne more and have been through all, the best and gentlest creature that ever shed happiness on every one she knew," said Mrs. Maylie, embracing her tenderly. "Come, come, my love, remember who this is who waits to clasp you in his arms, poor child. See here, look, my dear." "Not aunt," cried Oliver, throwing his arms about her neck. "I'll never call her aunt. Sister, my own dear sister, that something taught my heart to love so dearly from the first. Rose, dear,
darling Rose!" Let the tears which fell, and the broken words which were exchanged in the long, close embrace between the orphans, be sacred. A father, sister, and mother were gained and lost in that one moment. Joy and grief were mingled in the cup, but there were no bitter tears, for even grief itself arose so softened and clothed in such sweet and tender recollections that it became a solemn pleasure and lost all character of pain. They were a long, long time alone. A soft tap at the door at length announced that someone was without. Oliver opened it, glided away, and gave place to Harry Maylie. "I know it all," he said, taking a seat beside the lovely girl. "Dear Rose, I know it all. I am not here by accident," he added, after a lengthened silence. "Nor have I heard all this tonight, for I knew it yesterday, only yesterday. Do you guess that I have come to remind you of a promise?" "Stay," said Rose. "You do know all?" "All. You gave me leave at any time within a year to renew the subject of our last discourse. I did. Not to press you to alter your determination," pursued the young man, "but to hear you repeat it if you would. I was to lay whatever of station or fortune I might possess at your feet, and if you still adhered to your former determination, I pledged myself by no word or act to seek to change it. The same reasons which influenced me then will influence me now," said Rose firmly. "How you harden your heart against me, Rose," urged her lover. "Oh, Harry, Harry," said the young girl, bursting into tears, "I wish I could, and spare myself this pain." "Then why inflict it on yourself?" said Harry, taking her hand. "Think, dear Rose, think what you have heard tonight." "And what have I heard? What have I heard?" cried Rose. "That a sense of his deep disgrace so worked upon my own father that he shunned all. There, we have said enough, Harry. We have said enough." "Not yet, not yet," said the young man, detaining her as she rose. "My hopes, my wishes, prospects, feelings, every thought in life except my love for you, have undergone a change. I offer you, now, no distinction among a bustling crowd, no mingling with a world of malice and detraction, where the blood is called into honest cheeks by aught but real disgrace and shame, but a home, a heart and home. Yes, dearest Rose, and those alone are all I have to offer." "What do you mean?" she faltered. "I mean but this, that when I left you last, I left you with a firm determination to level all fancied barriers between yourself and me, and resolved that if my world could not be yours, I would make yours mine, that no pride of birth should curl the lip at you, for I would turn from it. This I have done. Those who have shrunk from me because of this have shrunk from you, and proved you so far right. Such power and patronage, such relatives of influence and rank as smiled upon me then, look coldly now. But there are smiling fields and waving trees in England's richest county, and by one village church, mine, Rose, my own, there stands a rustic dwelling which you can make me prouder of than all the hopes I have renounced, increased 1,000-fold. This is my rank and station now, and here I lay it down." The court was paved from floor to roof with human faces. Inquisitive and eager eyes peered from every inch of space. From the rail before the dock away into the sharpest angle of the smallest corner in the galleries, all looks were fixed upon one man, Fagin. Before him and behind, above, below, on the right and on the left, he seemed to stand surrounded by a firmament, all bright with gleaming eyes. He stood there in all this glare of living light, with one hand resting on the wooden slab before him, the other held to his ear, and his head thrust forward to enable him to catch with greater distinctness every word that fell from the presiding judge, who was delivering his charge to the jury.
At times Fagin turned his eyes sharply upon them to observe the effect of the slightest featherweight in his favour, and when the points against him were stated with terrible distinctness, looked towards his counsel in mute appeal that he would even then urge something in his behalf. Beyond these manifestations of anxiety, he stirred not hand or foot. He had scarcely moved since the trial began, and now that the judge ceased to speak, he still remained in the same strained attitude of close attention, with his gaze bent on him, as though he listened still. A slight bustle in court recalled him to himself. Looking round, he saw that the jurymen had turned together to consider their verdict. They sought permission to retire. He looked wistfully into their faces one by one when they passed out, as though to see which way the greater number leant. But that was fruitless. The jailer touched him on the shoulder. He followed mechanically to the end of the dock and sat down on a chair. The man pointed it out, or he would not have seen it. He looked up into the gallery again. Some of the people were eating, and some fanning themselves with handkerchiefs, for the crowded place was very hot. There was one young man sketching his face in a little notebook. He wondered whether it was like, and looked on when the artist broke his pencil point and made another with his knife, as any idle spectator might have done. In the same way, when he turned his eyes towards the judge, his mind began to busy itself with the fashion of his dress, and what it cost, and how he put it on. There was an old fat gentleman on the bench, too, who had gone out some half an hour before, and now come back. He wondered within himself whether this man had been to get his dinner, and what he had, and where he had it, and pursued this train of careless thought until some new object caught his eye and roused another. Not that all this time his mind was, for an instant, free from one oppressive, overwhelming sense of the grave that opened at his feet. It was ever present to him, but in a vague and general way, and he could not fix his thoughts upon it. Thus, even while he trembled and turned burning hot at the idea of speedy death, he fell to counting the iron spikes before him, and wondering how the head of one had been broken off, and whether they would mend it or leave it as it was. Then he thought of all the horrors of the gallows and the scaffold, and stopped to watch a man sprinkling the floor to cool it, and then went on to think again. At length there was a cry of silence, and a breathless look from all towards the door. The jury returned and passed him close. He could glean nothing from their faces. They might as well have been of stone. Perfect stillness ensued. Not a rustle, not a breath. Guilty. The building rang with a tremendous shout, and another, and then it echoed deep, loud groans that gathered strength as they swelled out like angry thunder. It was a peal of joy from the populace outside, greeting the news that he would die on Monday. The noise subsided, and he was asked if he had anything to say why sentence of death should not be passed upon him. He had resumed his listening attitude, and looked intently at his questioner while the demand was made, but it was twice repeated before he seemed to hear it. And then he only muttered that he was an old man. An old man. An old man. And so, dropping into a whisper, was silent again. The judge assumed the black cap, and the prisoner stood still. The address was solemn and impressive, the sentence fearful to hear. But he stood like a marble figure without the motion of a nerve. His haggard face was still thrust forward, his underjaw hanging down, and his eyes staring out before him, when the jailer put his hand upon his arm and beckoned him away. He gazed stupidly about him for an instant, and obeyed. The jailer led him to one of the condemned cells and left him there, alone. Then came night, dark, dismal, silent night. Other watchers are glad to hear the church clock strike, for they tell of life and coming day. To the Jew they brought despair. The boom of every iron bell came laden with the one deep hollow sound. Death. Saturday night. He had only one night more to live. And as he thought of this, the day broke. Sunday. It was not until the night of this last awful day that a withering sense of his helpless, desperate state came in its full intensity upon his blighted soul. Not that he had ever held any defined or positive hope of mercy, but that he had never been able to consider more than the dim probability of dying so soon. The fortunes of those who have figured in this tale are nearly closed. The little that remains to their historian to relate is told in few and simple words. Before 3 months had passed, Rose and Harry were married in the village church, which was henceforth to be the scene of the young clergyman's labours. On the same day they entered into possession of their new and happy home. Mrs. Maylie took up her abode with her son and daughter-in-law to enjoy during the tranquil remainder of her days the greatest felicity that age and worth can know, the contemplation of the happiness of those on whom the warmest affections and tenderest cares of a well-spent life have been increasingly bestowed. It appeared on full and careful investigation that if the wreck of property remaining in the custody of monks, which had never prospered either in his hands or in those of his mother, were equally divided between himself and Oliver, it would yield to each little more than £3,000. Mr. Brownlow, unwilling to deprive the elder son of the opportunity of retrieving his former vices and pursuing an honest career, proposed this mode of distribution, to which his young charge joyfully acceded. Monks, still bearing that assumed name, retired with his portion to a distant part of the New World, where, having quickly squandered it, he once more fell into his old courses, and, after undergoing a long confinement for some fresh act of fraud and knavery, at length sunk under an attack of his old disorder, and died in prison. Mr. Brownlow adopted Oliver as his own son, removing with him and the old housekeeper to within a mile of the parsonage house where his dear friends resided. He gratified the only remaining wish of Oliver's warm and earnest heart, and thus linked together a little society whose condition approached as nearly to one of perfect happiness as can ever be known in this changing world. How Mr. Brownlow went on from day to day, filling the mind of his adopted child with stores of knowledge, and becoming attached to him more and more as his nature developed itself. How the two orphans, tried by adversity, remembered its lessons in mercy to others, and mutual love, and fervent thanks to him who had protected and preserved them. These are all matters which need not be told. I have said that they were truly happy, and without strong affection and humanity of heart, and gratitude to that being whose code is mercy, and whose great attribute is benevolence to all things that breathe, true happiness can never be attained. Within the altar of the old village church there stands a white marble tablet which bears as yet but one word, Agnes. There is no coffin in that tomb, and may it be many, many years before another name is placed above it. But if the spirits of the dead ever come back to earth to visit spots hallowed by the love beyond the grave of those whom they knew in life, I believe that the shade of Agnes sometimes hovers round that solemn nook. I believe it nonetheless because that nook is in a church, and she was weak and erring.